morning dear students. I am Mrs. JayaLakshmi, working as senior lecturer in zoology. Today I am here to explain the topic body fluids and circulation under human physiology and anatomy. Before going in detail with the topic, we should know the two different types of circulatory systems present in the animal kingdom, right? Open type and closed type of circulatory system, right. So, this closed type of circulatory system is present in all the chordates as well as in the non-chordates, which includes the nemertines, cephalopod mollusks, annelids, etc. Whereas the open type of circulatory system is present in the arthropods and the other mollusks. So, the difference between this open type and closed type of circulatory system is that in closed type of circulatory system, the blood flows through closed channels, the blood vessels, that is the arteries and veins interconnected by what are known as capillaries. So, the flow of the blood is through these blood vessels which takes place in the tissues, right. Whereas, on the other hand, in the open type of circulatory system, such capillaries are absent and the blood flows through these closed channels, that is the vessels, but then they are not interconnected with these capillaries, whereas on the other hand they are interconnected with some small spaces which are known as blood sinuses derived from the embryonic blastocele. Right, and these blood sinuses later they form what are known as hemocele, right, and the type of circulatory fluid present here is what is known as hemolymph, right. So, this is the basic difference between the open type and closed type of circulatory systems, right. Then coming to the chordates which have a closed type of circulatory system, starting with the Pisces up to the mammals, there are different chambered hearts present here in the chordates which have a different type of body fluid circulation. So, let us see that. Right. In the chambered heart of different chordates, so if you see with the Pisces, they have a single circulation and the type of respiration here is branchial respiration. That means the gills which are present here help for the transport of blood or for the exchange of the blood, and the exchange of the blood is between the gills and the heart. They have only single circulation, right, and it has only two chambered heart. One is atria and the other one is the ventricle. Whereas coming to the next class, that is the class amphibians, right. Here they have a three chambered heart, that is two atria and one ventricle, right. So, here a mixed type of blood can be seen or it is evident. Whereas next to the reptiles also have a three chambered heart, but whereas with the exception the crocodiles and alligators have a four chambered heart. Next, proceeding with the birds and mammals, they have a well developed four chambered heart having two atria and two ventricles. The atria receive the deoxygenated blood, whereas the ventricles pump the blood. The right atrium receives the deoxygenated blood and the left atrium receives the oxygenated blood which is pumped from the lungs, right. So, always the atria are the receiving chambers and the ventricles are the pumping chambers, right. So, let us go in detail with the structure of heart. Coming to the external structure of heart, the heart is located in the mediastinum and an adult human being has the heart weighing about 300 grams, right, and it is located in the thoracic cavity above the diaphragm, protected by the protected in the rib cage with the vertebral column at the back. And coming to the structure, so if you can see here, there is a deep notch like structure which is known as coronary sulcus, right. So, this can be made to differentiate the heart into chambers, the two atria and the ventricles, right. And then this is the vena cava, which brings deoxygenated blood from different parts of the body, and this portion is what is known as the aorta, which carries the oxygenated blood, right. So, going in detail with the external structure of heart, the heart possesses 4 chambers. Right. So, left atrium, right ventricle and left ventricle. So, such demarcation of the 4 chambers is seen externally, but then internally the 2 atria are separated by what are known as interatrial septum, and they have a notch like structure which is known as auricular appendage, right, and it receives the different deoxygenated blood from different parts of the body through different vena cavae, which are known as inferior vena cava and superior vena cava. The superior vena cava brings deoxygenated blood from the upper parts of the body, so it does not need a valve to control it, whereas the inferior vena cava brings deoxygenated blood from the lower parts of the body, which is guarded by a valve or a sphincter which is known as Eustachian valve, right. And then the coronary sinus, that is the system that carries that controls or carries blood to the muscles of the heart, it also brings blood into the right atrium and is guarded by a valve which is known as Thebesius valve, right. So, this is all about the right atrium, which brings which receives the deoxygenated blood from different parts of the body. Whereas coming to the left atrium, as it was told, the left atrium is always associated with the oxygenated blood. So, the different pulmonary veins bring oxygenated blood into the left atrium. Is that clear? And then in the right hand corner of the right atrium, you see a sinoatrial node, a special type of nodal tissue which has the capacity to generate an action potential. Therefore, it acts as a pacemaker, and whatever impulses or whatever action potential is generated, it will be carried to the atrioventricular node, right? Then the two atria are separated by interatrial septum. The two ventricles are separated by the interventricular septum. The atria and ventricles are separated by atrioventricular partitions, right? And then at the junction of the right atrium and the right ventricle, you see two different valves here, right? So here it's the tricuspid valve, and between the left atrium and left ventricle it is accommodated with bicuspid valve or mitral valve. So the flow of the blood takes place from the atria into the ventricles through these valves which are present here. The valves, that is the tricuspid valve and the bicuspid valve, prevent the backward flow of the blood. So as long as the pressure of the blood or the turbulence of the blood is more in the atria, these valves are kept open to enhance the blood flow into the ventricles, right? And one more point. So here between the two atria there is a notch like structure which is what is known as foramen ovale, which is kept open in the fetal condition. Once the baby is born, this is closed and then it is what is known as fossa ovalis. And even after birth, if it is still open, then it is what is known as patent foramen ovale, right? Then, so whatever impulses or action potential is carried from sinoatrial node to the atrioventricular node, this passes down through the ventricles through what is known as bundle of His or AV bundle, right? And in the internal structure of that of the ventricles have some muscles which are present here, which are what are known as papillary muscles, having some column like structures which are known as columnae carneae, right? And then these have what are known as heart strings like this, which are known as chordae tendinae. So these chordae tendinae, or what are known as heart strings, hold the valves in position and prevent the ventricles or these tricuspid valves or bicuspid valves to hurt the atria during the ventricular contraction. And whatever action potential is generated from SAN to AVN, it is passed to the bundle of His and is spread to the entire ventricular musculature through fibers what are known as Purkinje fibers, right? So because of the presence of sinoatrial node which can generate its own action potential, the structure of heart is, or the working of the heart is what is known as, the nature of the heart is myogenic in nature. No doubt even the neural system like the epinephrine, adrenaline, and they also try to regulate the heartbeat, but then the heartbeat can be initiated with the working of the sinoatrial node itself, right? So proceeding to the next part. So what all I have mentioned, so let us see with that of the, with the help of the diagram. So this aorta, what is there, which starts from the ventricle, the left ventricle carries the oxygenated blood. So that is the reason it's showing red here. And then the pulmonary artery carries the deoxygenated blood, and the pulmonary veins carry or bring the oxygenated blood into the left atrium which leads into the left ventricle. So as it was said, there is a bicuspid valve which is having two cusps here, and then bundle of his. So whatever information is generated from sinoatrial node is brought to the atrioventricular node, carried to the bundle of his, right? And this is the interventricular septum, and between the right atrium and right ventricle there is a tricuspid valve which prevents the backward flow of the blood into the right atrium, and these are the chordae tendineae, the heart strings, the atrioventricular node, the right atrium and the sinoatrial node. So the vena cava, as I told you, the superior vena cava and inferior vena cava bring deoxygenated blood from different respective parts of the body, right? So let us proceed with the working of the heart, the cardiac cycle and cardiac output. So in the working of the human heart, so as it was said, so the oxygenated blood to the upper parts of the body is supplied with the aorta, right? So we have a double circuit system, complete double circulation, right? So what is this complete double circulation? Blood flows to the heart or through the heart twice in the form of deoxygenated blood and oxygenated blood. So we have two types of circulations: pulmonary circulation the other one is systemic circulation. So in pulmonary circulation, oxygenated blood which is pumped from the left ventricle is supplied to all parts of the body, whereas in the systemic circulation the deoxygenated blood is associated with it. Is that clear? Right. So here you can see clearly the pulmonary veins which are carrying the oxygenated blood, the aorta, and then the inferior vena cava enhancing the deoxygenated blood collection, the pulmonary arteries and the superior vena cava, right? Then next, proceeding with the cardiac cycle, the events which take place during a heartbeat is what is known as cardiac cycle, right? So each cardiac cycle can be associated or can be called as one heartbeat. So the cardiac cycle are the cyclical events which take place during the pumping of the blood into the respective parts of the body, right? So what happens in a cardiac cycle? Atrial systole, which lasts for usually 0.1 seconds, whereas the atrial diastole, which is known as relaxation, lasts for 0.7 seconds, whereas the ventricular systole takes 0.3 seconds, ventricular diastole takes 0.5 seconds, right? And all the four chambers of the heart do not contract or relax at the same time, but they try to pulsate in a fixed manner such that after the atria contract, the ventricles will contract, and the relaxation and the entire process. So, they pulsate in a fixed manner, but they do not contract or relax simultaneously at the same time, right. And then for a cardiac cycle or for one heartbeat to take place, usually the heart beats 72 to 75 times in a minute. So, if we divide it 60 by 75, so in 1 minute, so it takes 0.8 seconds for one heartbeat to last, right. So, during atrial systole, what happens? The blood which is present in atria, that is in the right atrium, the deoxygenated blood, and in the left atrium, the oxygenated blood. So, in this blood, lots of pressure and turbulence will be there, and then the atrioventricular nodes, that is the valves, that is tricuspid valve and the bicuspid valve are open, so that the blood flows into the respective parts of the ventricles, right. That happens during atrial systole. Systole is nothing but contraction, whereas in atrial diastole, the chambers of the atria relax, whereas during ventricular systole, the ventricles contract, and at that time, since the pressure or turbulence of the blood is more in the ventricles, these AV valves will be closed and semilunar valves will open, so that whatever blood is there in the ventricles will be pumped into the respective aorta and into the pulmonary arteries, right. So, the ventricular systole lasts for 0.3 seconds and the ventricular diastole lasts for 0.5 seconds. So, during this process, the blood is pumped into their respective parts with the help of the sinoatrial node and atrioventricular node that generates the action potentials, enabling the atria and ventricles to contract and relax, right. Then cardiac output. So, because the atria and ventricles are contracting and relaxing, right, what is the output? How much amount of blood is pumped out by the ventricles? That is what we study in the cardiac output. So, cardiac output is equal to stroke volume into number of beats per minute. So, the stroke volume is 70 ml and the number of beats per minute is 75. So, that accounts to 5250 ml odd, that is equal to 5 liters. So, 5 liters of blood will be pumped for during one cardiac cycle, right. Like this, so much amount of blood is pumped in a day, right, and out of which 10% of the blood will be taken by the cardiac muscles itself, right, whereas 20% of it goes to the kidneys, 15% of it goes to the brain, 30% of it goes to the other body parts. Clear? So, that is about the cardiac output. So, this is about the working of the heart, the cardiac cycle and cardiac output. So, as a part of this, the mention about the blood clotting also plays an important role. So, what is this blood clotting? This is also what is known as hemostasis or blood clotting or coagulation of the blood. Right. So, in our blood, So the blood includes even the plasma also. So in our body fluids, blood includes only 45%, whereas plasma makes up 55%. Okay. So this 45% includes the RBC, the red blood cells, WBC, the white blood cells, as well as the blood platelets. Right. Whereas out of this 55% of the plasma, 92% is the water itself and 8% solutes. What are these 8% solutes? They include albumin, globulin, prothrombin and fibrinogen. Right. So what happens during blood clotting? Whenever there is an injury to a blood vessel, if it is in the internal environment, that means in the internal part of the body, the clot that is formed is what is known as thrombus. And if this thrombus continues, it can be fatal to the life also. Whereas if the injury is an external injury, then what happens? That is the mechanism which we are going to see now, right? So what happens during an external injury? Whenever there is a cut in the blood vessel, right, or in a tissue, the platelets which are there will adhere to the blood injured part, right, and some sequence or some steps take place enhancing the blood coagulation, right. So let us see what those steps are. So the damaged tissues or the vessel or whatever it is, they release one enzyme which is called as thromboplastin, which is lipoproteinaceous in nature, right. Whereas the blood platelets also release this thromboplastin, that is platelet factor 3, which is phospholipid in nature, right. So in presence of this thromboplastin, prothrombin gets converted to thrombin, and during this process heparin which is there will be inactivated, because heparin is always sees that always the blood is kept in a solution condition. Why? Because heparin is an anticoagulant, right. So in the presence of thrombin, fibrinogen will be converted to monomers by the process of depolymerization, and by the process of repolymerization it gets converted into polymers, that is nothing but a fibrin, a mesh like structure which will try to seal the wound, and this entire process usually takes within 2 to 8 minutes once the blood vessel is damaged, right. So after the blood clot is formed, after some time the process that happens is what is known as the formation of serum, or what it is known as clot retraction. So, the serum is a bit yellowish in color. So, serum is nothing but blood plasma minus blood corpuscles and fibrinogen. So, this is in the presence of calcium, right. So, this entire process takes place helping for the blood clotting, right. Next, ECG. So, ECG can be expanded as electrocardiogram, right. So, whatever action potentials which are generated from sinoatrial node passed to the atrioventricular node to the entire ventricular musculature, all the conduction of these action potentials can be recorded in an electrocardiograph, because those electrical impulses can be recorded. So, for doing this, some electrodes, the lead electrodes, are placed at the level of the chest, legs and the arms to record this electrical activity that is taking place in the walls of the heart. So, that is what is known as ECG, electrocardiogram, and the device or the diagnostic tool to observe this is what is known as electrocardiograph, right. So, the entire activity of the heart is recorded in the form of a graph like this, right. So, a small P wave which is there, so this corresponds to atrial systole, right, or what is known as atrial depolarization. So, a P wave is a small wave, whereas the QRS, the entire ECG is observed with the help of what are known as waves, intervals and segments. So, in QRS, Q wave, there is a small deflection here, then a very upright R and a small triangular portion, the S, and then the T wave is a dome shaped structure. So, this QRS wave, together we call it as QRS complex, corresponds to ventricular depolarization, whereas the T wave represents the ventricular repolarization. So, during an ECG, what they do is they try to compare the electrical activity of a patient with that of a normal ECG. So, suppose if there is a prolonged P wave, so it indicates the enlarged atria. So, any abnormalities in the heart or corresponding to the conduction of the action potentials, or any disorders or hypertrophy or atrophy of the heart muscles, all that can be recorded in the ECG itself. So, an enlarged P wave corresponds to enlarged atria, whereas an enlarged Q wave corresponds to myocardial infarction. Right, whereas an enlarged T wave corresponds to insufficient oxygen supply to the heart, what is known as hypoxia, right. So, these are the indications which are observed through an ECG. Last but not the least, the disorders. So the disorders associated with the circulatory system are, so many disorders are related to the circulatory system. Likewise, angina pectoris, coronary artery disease, myocardial infarction, or we can call it as heart attack, heart failure, pericarditis, right, etc. So first in pericarditis, so pericardium is the outer layer covering that of the heart, which can be differentiated into a visceral layer and a parietal layer. Okay, so between these two layers there is a space which is known as pericardial cavity. So during pericarditis, this pericardial cavity, instead of being filled with the pericardial fluid, blood and other fluid get accumulated here and puts a pressure on the or compression on the heart, which can be fatal and can lead to the death of the person. So this condition is what is known as pericarditis. So this happens whenever there is an injury or damage to that of the muscles of the heart. Whereas angina pectoris, which is usually called as chest pain. So this happens usually, the pain starts with the pain in the chest, radiating to the elbow, to that of the neck as well as to that of the shoulder. What happens during angina pectoris? There is again a damage to one part of the heart where there will be insufficient supply of oxygen or blood to the parts of the heart. So insufficient blood supply to the heart is what is known as ischemia. And obviously whenever there is ischemia, it will be accompanied with even hypoxia condition also, thereby leading to the condition what is known as angina pectoris. Then next one, coronary artery disease, and then myocardial infarction. So this myocardial infarction usually happens because of what is known as atherosclerosis. So what is atherosclerosis? Athero means artery, sclerosis. So why this sclerosis happens? Because artery by nature itself, it has a very narrow lumen because it has two elastic lamina. So during atherosclerosis, there is deposition of some unwanted materials like cholesterol, and because of prolonged smoking, because of prolonged consumption of alcohol and all, so unwanted materials, they get deposited on the walls of the artery in the endothelial lining, making the lumen of the artery to become much more narrower. So due to which there will be insufficient supply of blood and oxygen to the muscles of the heart itself, which can be fatal, right? As well as next, the heart failure, right? So these are the different disorders related to the circulatory system. So this was what I was telling you. So in atherosclerosis, so this is a smooth muscle, the endothelium. So here the macrophages transform into foam cells, right? So these are all getting deposited. So artery is becoming narrower. So this is what is known as a plaque. Plaque is the unwanted material which is getting deposited in the inner lining of the walls of that of the artery. So with this, I conclude the topic of the body fluids and circulation.